like so many of the rabid fans for the Chess.com Computer Chess Championships, I had to make sure to check in to see what would happen when Lc0 took on the engine leading the event, last name Fish, first name Stock. Maybe you've heard of him. But the question was, what could the queen herself, Leela, come up with when playing the white pieces? Now, as I said, I wasn't surprised to see the chat buzzing during this marquee matchup, but I was surprised to see so many people still there when the position seemed like it was clearly petering out to a draw. Even after Leela's move on the board, the last try being this h3 stab, Stockfish still evaluated the position as zeros. And you don't argue with a man that has a table base hooked up to his many core CPUs or whatever Stockfish is operating on. But I did find the position really instructive, and I really respected Leela's last very human, strong grandmaster-ish way to create one last pitfall, one last opportunity in which Stockfish might go wrong. And to understand why I'm saying that h3 is this opportunity, we're going to hop over now to the Batcave and let the analysis board take us away. I hope you put on your I want to learn pants today, because we're about to stuff those pockets full of knowledge. So, to start, we back up a single move and explain exactly why white can't play the really obvious move, the move that any of us would love to play if we can win a piece for free against Stockfish, AA Queen. Well, strong players will immediately recognize this position isn't even worth calculating, because the lone pawn you have left is not queening on the color of the color square that you need for this bishop to be useful. In other words, it's a theoretical draw even up a piece. If you were to take away all of Stockfish's remaining 3 pawns, white is still not threatening to win, due to the fact that as long as this king reaches the corner, the bishop here is helpless, and the pawn, being a corner pawn, is unable to force the king away from the promotion square. That's the quick way to describe the fact that you can't even consider queening and letting black give up the knight for the pawn. It's obvious as well that probably black can come forward with the king and force a trade of this pawn if you want to. So the first thing we've established as far as a pattern and a piece of knowledge we need to have in this position to understand why Leela played h3 is that we can never ever expect to get a queen where this knight can give itself up and think we still have a chance to win the endgame. That's number one. So if that's the case, what's the second idea we might come up with? Well, given that the only chance we have is still on the queen side, despite the fact that we may not be able to win by letting the knight give itself up, we know we really don't have any chances for our one pawn to beat these 3. So the other idea that comes to mind is, what if we try to run up the board to remove this knight from said critical square and then get a queen? Well, some quick math tells us that while this seems like the most straightforward idea, probably black's pawns are far enough advanced to compete at least equally in the race. One line that makes that very clear is that after king to c3, black pushes. If we go all in on this idea, black pushes again. Yes, the bishop can flex his muscles, that he can move in the open board much faster and more powerfully than the knight. The problem is black has way too many pawns, and after h4 the king comes up. We see immediately moves like h3. Suddenly the bishop is overwhelmed as far as what exactly to guard. Staying in front of the f-pawn being the only move that keeps winning chances alive, we see g3. We're taking h3 would allow us to take h2. Taking g3 would allow h2. And it's actually black who's likely on the upper side of things here. So while we've established, yes, we can't win if we're going to let the knight give up, there's probably very few lines where we could actually bring our king forward and successfully get this knight away from the pawn. Now, if we could somehow make it less easy for black to just advance these pawns up the board, if we could somehow create some problems for these pawns, all of a sudden this idea of bringing the king up becomes a viable option. Now we see the move h3 come into play, and why I loved it so much as soon as I saw Leela play it. I'm watching the chat go crazy at this point and considering that, okay, as much as this is one nice idea, there's a reason Stockfish had this position at zeros. There's no way that the strongest engine on the planet is going to capture on h3 and go for the type of endgame that would be losing. Why is it losing? First, let me show you that after g takes h3, now that we've created a situation where these pawns are both on the same diagonal, suddenly we've put this bishop in a position to be the most powerful piece on the board. This bishop is not only going to be able to continue to help us threaten to get a queen, It's going to guard critical squares for this knight trying to get active. And it's also going to prevent every pawn from pushing. We no longer have a situation with 3 connected passers where the bishop can't stop them. We have pawns that, yeah, there's 3 of them, but there might as well only be 2, and our bishop is ideally placed to deal with them. A variation that illustrates this would be something like we bring the king forward, and if black tries to stop white from advancing, you're going to see that eventually zugzwang occurs no matter what. The king comes to c4, the king comes to d6. Currently a blockade is set up, but now the bishop moves, and we start to see the zugzwang take place. Black will eventually run out of moves. And when he does, the king will have to retreat. As we've already established, the knight has no options here to move without the queen. If the king retreats, the white king comes up. We can rinse and repeat this process until we've eventually established a zugzwang. If the king had gone to d8 or d6, the same thing would have occurred with the king moving in. Make a funny move with the bishop, and no matter where this king goes, we put our bishop on c6, and you can see the zugzwang that has occurred. Key to note, of course, as well, is that these pawns don't have any way to change this scenario. The main line I've analyzed here, of course, is that if the king went to c8 after the bishop moves, we eventually come into c6, and as said, black does reach zugzwang. So now we've established 3 things, very instructive and important to understand as you, a human, might become a better endgame player. Forget about these engines you love watching in the Chess.com Computer Chess Championships, but how can we approach endgames at a high level? The only way to do it is not by calculating these lines a million moves a minute, but by having a whole bunch of positions that we know theoretically because of the work we've done, because of videos we've watched, because of books we've studied. And when you start to become familiar with this idea that a bishop has the ability to outplay the knight in the open board and eventually put black in zugzwang, that allows you to see why something like h3 is so creative and such an interesting way for Leela to create a pitfall, right? We already established one reason why you have a database of knowledge of patterns that this pawn can't win if the bishop is the wrong color corner, so that we don't play moves like this. We've established basic calculation that says we can't just come forward willy-nilly, we're not going to win. But h3 maybe creates this opportunity for that to happen if Stockfish, which sounds crazy to say, if Stockfish blunders. It's an oxymoron sentence, right? But when h3 was played, I fully expected, like everyone else, that the zeros there was because any move that doesn't take here, literally any king move, the most obvious of which might be something like king g5, bring the king in to h4 and force the capture, as this would prevent black from just winning the pawn with the king. And if something like this occurs, we can see in many lines once again that the 2 pawns and the king are going to be plenty fast enough to prevent white from just rushing forward. But suddenly, Stockfish played g takes h3. I'm thinking, right? So I'm in chat right now, and I'm still seeing zeros from Stockfish. Still seeing a lot of people in chat just saying, what's going on here? What's the point of this game continuing? But I'm flabbergasted and in my mode of, is there something wrong with Chess.com server? Are we sure Stockfish is okay? Because I'm suddenly seeing for the first time a plan that might be winning for white. And indeed, Leela played the move king to d3. And after h2, she came forward with the move king to c4. I'm looking at a position where not only is my bishop ideally placed, and I'm familiar with this pattern that I've even used to win in games myself in bishop for knight, and Stockfish's king isn't even trying to attempt to blockade me. So I start calculating, what if black plays moves like h4 and then eventually comes over? I'm thinking, okay, maybe I was just wrong. Black's king can get there and stop it. But after moves like bishop f3, again, the king moves. We come into c6. At some point, the zugzwang will occur. The pawns will either just start giving themselves up, or you'll move your king away from your knight, or your knight will move and I'll get a queen. So I'm not able to visualize what in the world Stockfish could be doing. And again, I'm in full, isn't Stockfish hooked up to a table-based mode? Osanti2, shout out to the Twitch user who I said I would do this video for. I don't lie. And everybody else is saying I'm crazy for thinking there's any chances here. Danny, the table base says zeros. Who are you to argue with such information? And I agree. I felt in a very weird state. I don't want to talk about it, right? And then Stockfish plays the move king to g5. So I'm thinking from a chess knowledge perspective of how humans try to play like engines. We apply our own table base. I don't have a table base, but I have a database of knowledge and patterns that I'm familiar with. I'm thinking something very strange is going on here, especially when I actually start to calculate, thinking I was just going to check in on this before bed. I see a very, very clear winning line for white. And we end up going down that line. King to c5. The king comes to g4. At this point, the only opportunity for black, out of desperation, he must try to block the diagonal of this bishop in order to get a queen. But pretty straightforward calculation says, after f3, white has a nice tactic. You can pause the video if you want to find it, but it's based on a very common theme of putting your enemy king on a mine square. Some call it a landmine, a bad square, so that when you get a queen, it comes with check, with tempi. And that, of course, is to take here with check first. Taking the knight would allow black to get the queen, right? So we take with check, put the king on this landmine square, now capture, and we immediately see that h1 queen would lose on the spot. Skewer and Ouchtown for Stockfish. But still, I'm being told I'm crazy because after king f2, a8 queen, the table base and all the users are saying this is a draw because the table base says it so, because Stockfish says it so. I can't disagree at this point with the zeros, still very skeptical. I've actually pinged team members in our Slack room, like, is everything okay with the CCCC? Because I'm looking at this position with the database of knowledge in my head that there is a very, very well-known pattern that says, yes, the corner pawn is normally a draw. If you take this pawn off, I surely agree with you. But there are very, very common tricks that occur whenever your opponent has an extra pawn that allow you to win. To illustrate that point, I'm actually going to just set up the position here and show you that if we were to, for example, be able to put our queen anywhere, like this square here, g3, okay, with black to play, now you say this is still a draw, and this was the point I was trying to illustrate for Asante too and the rest of the chat, that obviously you can't go here because now I win the pawn in the game. So your move is king to h1. Well, the issue here is a very important trick that, like I said, I'm stuffing your pockets full of knowledge here, so get ready. Whenever your opponent has an extra tempo move of any kind, the corner pawn does not draw because of a well-known mating trap. You move the queen a knight's check away, no matter what square the pawn goes to, I don't care what pawn it is on the board, they have to make a move, zugzwang, and you checkmate them on f1. As long as your queen can reach the square that I'm setting up here, right, where the king is in check, sorry, after the king goes to h1, as long as the queen can reach this square where the king has to go here, this is a very, very common mating net. So now we go back to the position of the game and ask ourselves, oops, sorry about that. We're gonna back up, and actually we're just gonna reset it here. We're going to add it to be white to move. And we're going to reset it back to the game. And we're going to, so why was I so crazy? Well, I had no idea that this was one of those rare positions where for some reason, based on the position of the pawn, I actually can't get my queen to this magic square. In the game, Leela illustrated this by playing 1.5 million checks, bringing the queen exactly where I would have brought her, eventually behind the pawns, and suddenly you see that because we don't have this check, we have no ability to force the king away from the critical squares. We can check around all we want, but we can't get directly behind the pawn. So here's where things get exciting and where my mind continues to be blown, hence the thumbnail if that's what brought you in here. I proclaim, well, okay, I was wrong. Yes, you're right that I said that there was something wrong here. This is a win for white, and the Twitch users are having a field day, making fun of me. Very fun. But I said, well, this was just clearly one exception of a position where the table base had a huge advantage for Stockfish over Leela because of the fact that Stockfish just knows this is a draw, and Leela isn't able to calculate that. She's thinking about it more like me, right? We know that she plays more like strong grandmasters, not that I am one, than any other engine on the planet, but there was just this one exception that you can't really hold against her or me. Then all of a sudden, I made this proclaim, felt pretty good about it, left it. My wife's mad at me at this point. I keep talking about Leela and how amazing she is. Wifey wants to know who is Leela. I have a mistress. What's going on, right? So I got to go save my marriage. And as I'm saving my marriage, of course, I still can't get that lady out of my head as we're going to sleep at night. And the reason is that I realized not only was I wrong once for claiming that Stockfish was winning, or sorry, that Leela was winning and the Stockfish had blundered, I was wrong again in saying that this is the only exception. To show that, I move to our next board, where I've actually just put the pawn. We'll set it up again. I put the pawn one square further up, and again shown that yes, the pawn on h5 is a draw, but obviously the pawn on h4 must be a draw too because it guards this square. Put this queen on any imaginary square you want. She gets to g4, whatever. The point is we can't get to g3. So now I'm really feeling like a silly goose. Forget that mouse slip right there. As I'm going to sleep at night, thinking of all of the users, saying, okay, so there's two exceptions. Obviously, before I move on, there's got to be a third exception because with the pawn on h3, we don't have the ability to play queen f2. It would be stalemate. So if we're in a position like this, clearly it's also a draw because we don't have the ability to play queen f2 without the game ending peacefully. So now I'm thinking, okay, well, I've certainly solved the fact that means I have a new pattern to add to my database. Normally, I'd be right that the extra pawn doesn't help the corner pawn, but if the pawn is advanced at least to h5, that means all three of these pawns are a draw, and that should be good enough. No other pawns would be a draw, right? Right? Well, obviously not. What if the pawn is advanced far enough on the g file, right? I start recognizing that here, any sort of series of checks that we can do to get close, what is it going to be eventually? It's what's it all about, Alfie, right? We get here, and how do we get closer? We can't. Which should be obvious. That's when I actually knew. So now I realize I was wrong again. Mind continued to be blown, and I'm here to just own my shame that I spoke too quickly. So obviously with the g-pawn being there, I had to ask, well, does the same rule apply to the g-pawn? I just established that I didn't realize the pawn on h5 was far enough to prevent this theoretical trick. What about the pawn on g4 if we take away the legal moves and, let's set up a new position for all of us here? Well, it looks like this one should also be a draw because the only way we can inch our way behind a corner pawn is usually to use the checks behind the pawn. So let's use our queen and let's just check a doodle here and get as close as we can. And we realize how frustrating it is that we're never threatening to take this pawn with check because then we've gotten rid of our only advantage, which is the fact that they have to move our extra pawn while we checkmate them. So this one should also be a draw. What about the fifth rank for the G file? Well, here I'm happy to say that I wasn't totally crazy or so ill-equipped that to say that I didn't know that this one is a win. This one is indeed a win, specifically because, as I said, we now have the ability. I'm thinking this in my head. I'm thinking out loud, right? Now we have the ability to get behind the pawn, and the main reason is that you can't voluntarily stalemate yourself yet, even though the pawn is stuck, because I can go here, allow you to push. I can go here, allow you to push, and we have this checkmate. Very important pattern to know of everything we're talking about, right? But if we go back, okay, and you don't voluntarily stalemate but move over, now we can do the trick that we've been looking for all along, which is to force the king to the bad square. We go to the magic square and get our mating net. So when it comes to the g-pawn and the h-pawn, I now have improved my knowledge thanks to Stockfish and Leela, and I'm feeling a lot better about myself. Surely I don't think there's anything really more to learn as far as pawns that I maybe didn't know were theoretical draws. And then all of a sudden I thought of the pawn on f4, and I realized yet again I was wrong. How does white win this game? And I'm sitting there up all night thinking about this. And this was last night. I can't stop thinking about this game because I'm like, I made all these I guess partly the embarrassment, right? And I realized that there's another way that black draws based on the fact that this pawn is guarding the critical square. So another unique potential setup, a variation I've already shown, that the queen can inch her way forward, yes, but remember, we can never take the pawn with check. And when we get to this position of forcing the king in front of the pawn with this check, we can't play that check, right? So there's another pawn I didn't realize was actually a draw. I believe for sure I should have gone far enough now, right? And at this point, I'm thinking about the users, and I'm thinking that, okay, I'm completely crazy at this point. The engine evaluation was correct from the very beginning. Stockfish was right. What's going on, right, in the world today, and what have I actually learned from this? That must be it. Only the f-pawn could be far enough, right? And then all of a sudden, I thought of one last problem with my theory, the one you see in front of us, the e-pawn. How do we win with the e-pawn? let's say that we're able to work our way all the way to the g3 square. Now when the king moves, we still don't have our critical square of f2. Any sort of checks, taking the pawn we know doesn't work. Anything that doesn't force the king in front of the pawn, queens. So now I thought, okay, this is really unique, and I've gotten myself in a pickle where there's a number of pawns I just wasn't aware of. And this isn't even including the fact that I never should have said it to begin with, because technically every pawn along the second rank is also a one exception, right? Because you don't have time to stalemate them when they're getting a queen. So I've really eaten my words here in my head as I'm sleeping last night. And then I realized, wait a second, there's one last idea that you might be able to play for only with the e-pawn. And it's because the queen actually guards the square with check. You have a new idea to consider, which is that if you're able to get that king as far away as it seems, just close enough, you might actually be able to do the rare thing and the normal, the traditional way, the only way you ever have winning chances against a corner or bishop pawn, which is there some tricky way for your king to get close enough to allow promotion and then mate the king or queen? Well, in thinking of that in my head, I was finally able to go to sleep when I realized that this particular position was just one of those, because white's queen is guarding the promotion square. Notice there's nothing else for black to do because the king is stalemated, so this line is forced. And with the checks, we get the king to f4 just in time, and a very common idea many people know. After the queen, we give a check. Of course, moves like king to h3, get the king mated in the corner, self-mated or trapped by his own pieces, and the move king to g1 allows king to g3. And we have a trap where the queen is unable to give any checks, and the black king will be mated within the next move or so. So, what did we learn from all this? What we learned is a few things. Number one, never doubt Stockfish when he's got a table base hooked up to his head. The eval is correct, no matter what. Number two, don't proclaim single exceptions to things when rules are made to be broken. There may be many exceptions, and we're always reminded that we have more to learn. And I improved my ability to know the patterns of how I would evaluate these types of, can be very tricky endings where both sides are trying to queen. If you don't have patterns in those types of endings that you're relying on, you're dead in the water anyway, because usually you can't calculate enough to keep up with the position. It's very difficult in endgames to calculate those kind of lines, especially when you think of a practical game where you might be under time pressure. And then finally, I learned that the Twitch chat is always right. Trolls or not, the collective Twitch trolling is usually correct. And in this case, I was wrong to challenge them, and so I bow down, wore my Twitch shirt just for you here. And jokes aside, shout out to everybody that I have fun hanging out with. I hope that at this point we can all appreciate that there is now a resolution to the fact that these types of positions, we'll clear the board and reset. These types of positions with a corner pawn are indeed a draw, okay? And even when we add pawns back onto the board, there are a number of exceptions to this mating trick I showed. And I'm highlighting every single one of those squares for you now. Careful not to highlight the e3 square that taught me this valuable lesson. So, if you end up watching this video and decide that, Danny, you're still wrong. Oops, one more square. Danny, you're still wrong. You can also have a pawn on X square, and it's a draw. Please leave a comment and let me know. But I'd like to believe that after a long night, lonely night, where I was thinking more about Leela than my own dear sweet wife, I actually did eventually learn the lesson of how many different exceptions there are to that stalemate / mating net idea that I know in my head. And I will never again spend too much time claiming things that I don't know. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Again, leave a comment if I missed one. Apparently, I've got more to learn about these things, and we'll see you around on Chess.com and at the Chess.com Computer Chess Championship.